They say he did not die on the cross, and we say he did die on the cross. Here's the verse from the Quran. And this is Surah 4, verse 157 through 158. I'm sure you've all been reading that this week. It says, and for claiming that they killed the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, the messenger of God, in fact, they never killed him. They never crucified him. They were made to think that they did. All factions who are disputing this matter are full of doubt concerning this issue. They possess no knowledge. They only conjecture. For certain, they never killed him. Instead, God raised him to him. God raised Jesus to God. God is almighty, most wise. That's pretty clear. Now, I'm not an expert in the Quran. I haven't read the whole thing, but that's a fairly clear passage. I don't think it's some kind of a metaphor. I think they're making a very direct claim. Jesus did not die on the cross. And what do we think he did? He died on the cross. So let's compare the views of the cross between Islam and Christianity. And this is where it gets into the conversational mode. The Muslim is a really nice guy at work. We go to lunch now and then. Whether he ever becomes a Christian or not, he'll be a friend, very witty, engaging guy. I really like him. We've had some nice discussions. And what's interesting is he didn't even know that when I mentioned it. And I always, part of it's how you word it. I don't go at them like, here's what you think. I always turn it around and say, okay, here's my understanding. And I've done it with several Muslims. My understanding is that, do you think Jesus didn't die on the cross? And they're like, oh, yeah, no, we think it was a body double or Judas or something. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's a big difference. We think he did. Well, this guy didn't even know that the Quran said that. He's fairly new to this. So that was an interesting data point for him. I said, okay, well, why don't you go look into that? Tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. And then come back and see. Well, I think it'll be interesting to him, because he's a very logical person. And I just lay it out this way. I think it's a fairly charitable comparison. What do we have in Islam? We've got one sketchy revelation that says it was not Jesus. It definitely wasn't Jesus. They were made to think it was Jesus. It was not Jesus. Well, when did that revelation occur? Over 500 years after the event. I think Muhammad, it was like the late 500s. Crucifixion's around 30 AD. Over 550 years later, there's a revelation to one man that says, no, it wasn't Jesus. It was somebody else. Well, what does Christianity have to compare to that? Well, we've got very thorough, very early, within decades, accounts in the Bible by many, many, many witnesses, people who gave their lives for what they believed to be that truth. We have secular documentation. We have documentation outside the Bible by at least a half dozen valid historians who claim that, no, Jesus died on the cross. There was no debate. This wasn't even a hypothesis by anyone that it was someone else. It's considered a historical fact. Again, I said, go ask any historian; they'll tell you it was Jesus. And it was very close to the time. So I think if you just talk to somebody in conversation and said, okay, well, which would you think is more likely? Is it possible it wasn't Jesus? Well, yes, it's possible. But do you live your life, with putting the evidence on that side, or would you think the Christian case was more compelling if you've never heard? I think that just kind of plants a seed for them to think, does mine really line up to reality? This is actually kind of compelling here. So back to Islam. Another interesting thing is that in Islam, Allah leaves sins unpunished. You may have heard that and again, I always turn it around and make sure they validate it for me, because I don't want to put words in their mouth or mischaracterize their religion. I say, here's my understanding, that basically all your good and bad deeds are weighed in the scales, and if it's slightly positive or better, then you go to heaven or paradise, and if not, you don't. And then there's some kind of a wild card possibility that may get thrown out, or that he may just save you anyway. And they'll even say it like that. So, and this is where I'm very careful in how I word it, but I say, look, well, Christianity, God punishes all sin. Every one of my thousands and thousands of sins get punished. Either I take the punishment for what I deserve, or I trust in Jesus, accept his pardon, and my sins were paid for on the cross. But no sin goes unpunished. So that's just a difference. Again, that doesn't mean we're right, but it's a difference. But what was interesting is one gentleman I was talking to was very concerned about eternal life and matters, because he had a lot of family members die. And so we got into a really nice conversation, and I said, look, this doesn't prove mine's right. It's not like a selling point, but just by the way, Christianity offers assurance. Again, we're saved by grace through faith. Whether no matter how many sins you have, they're all paid for when you trust in Jesus. If I'm on the Islam mode, I said, I'm out of luck. I would quit Islam anyway, because there's no way I'm 51% good. I'm not even 10% good. And you laugh, I love saying that because, one, it's truthful, but it also disarms people who want to say, oh, you Christians think you're all that, you think you're so good, and that's why you're saved. It's like, no, you've completely misunderstood. I'm saved in spite of my badness, not because of my goodness. And I say, look, if I got to be 51%, I might as well just quit and go home. But it also, I emphasize just the assurance side of it, that it's like, oh no, I can trust that all my sins are forgiven, and I don't have to wonder, because even if it was this 51% model and I thought I had a shot, well, who's got the spreadsheet? You know, probably filled up my hard drive by now with all my sins. You know, it's like, how do you really know? I mean, how would you know? Because remember, our sins aren't just the things we do, it's the things we should have done and didn't do, and the things we thought and said. You know, it gets pretty ugly. So the other thing I point out, not necessarily directly to a Muslim, but if I was talking to kind of middle-of-the-road person, the fact that Islam started with violence and spread through violence and is violent to this day doesn't make it false. I mean, maybe, you know, Allah was true, and He said go be violent and, you know, kill these people. Well, then that would be a valid assessment. But to me, when I've been reading this book on church history and you look at the persecution, this wasn't for like a couple of years. We're talking 300 years of on and off, very intense persecution, you know, holding the Bible as a capital offense, I mean, all these things. I think that says something about the religion itself, that it didn't spread because it had a sword at your neck. It spread because people really believed it and were willing to give their lives. Finally, if you say, well, is it just the same? Well, they say Jesus is a prophet. We say he's God. There's a difference. Okay, switching gears. Mormonism. This is a growing religion. The Methodists are 30 times the size of the Mormon Church. They send out the same number of missionaries we do. These people are very committed to their belief system. Now, and there's an interesting dynamic with Mormons. In the last 20, 30 years, they started marketing themselves as Christians, another denomination. And I've got a quote from somebody that I really appreciated, very conceited, that he's like, yeah, we're not really. They have some rather unusual beliefs. On the surface, they seem the same. They're like, Jesus, 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 Jesus. They love talking about Jesus. But the problem is, when you peel back the layers, their definition of Jesus is different than our definition of Jesus by a lot. They have some other beliefs. They believe that we lived before we came to earth, and we kind of made a choice to come to earth to live out this life, and we have no memory of the prior life. And they'll try to point to verses in the Bible, but it's pretty much a stretch. They believe there's multiple levels of heaven, like Jesus is in one of them, and you may not get to that level and see him, and that kind of thing. They believe God used to be a man, that Jesus is the spirit brother of Lucifer, and that Jesus is a created being, and not the eternal God that we believe he is. They believe they're saved by works, although they'll throw the grace thing in there. They'll say, well, we're saved by grace after all you can do. I forget what passage that is. And because it sounds like, oh, saved by grace, that's Christian-y. But wait, after all you can do. Well, then you start parsing that statement, and I think, wait a minute, what if I don't do all I can do? Because I'm here to tell you, I haven't done all I could do. I could have done a lot more and a lot better. So that means I'm not saved, because the grace wasn't enough. If you do all you can, then grace is enough to save you. But if you don't do all you can, grace is not enough to save you. So who is your salvation dependent on? You. So it's dependent on you and not Jesus. So that's a very key difference. Now, excuse me. Do Mormons make great neighbors? Yes, I've had them as neighbors. They're wonderful people. They make great co-workers, they're pro-life, they're pro-family. There's a lot of things I really like about Mormons. But are they Christians? No. And sometimes people take that as an insult because sometimes people turn the word Christian into just an adjective for being nice. Like, oh, she's a real Christian lady. Well, maybe she exhibits Christian traits, but we're using Christian in a very particular way, like I'm a committed follower of Christ. So, technically speaking, they're not Christians, although they try to market themselves as that. But if you look back at their early literature, it couldn't be more obvious. They're like, the true church is gone from this planet. This is the real church. We are all false religions, and they're the real one. And I'm just pointing back and saying, look, just be honest. Say that you're different than us, and then we'll talk. But don't try to pretend we're the same and not the same. And I think you're familiar with the Christian themes. So here's a comment I got from a Mormon, because I point out to this to them when they try to do this doublespeak. I love this guy. I gave him a special post on my blog and said, thank you very much.